They all. They love you. You do. Hello, BookTube. And welcome to your Daily Penguin. I'm very glad that Frida is still speaking to me. I'm glad that she's still affectionate towards me, especially since I have had to significantly change our daily routines here at Hyde Cottage, significantly, because the temperature is going up into the mid or high 90s Fahrenheit every day. And a couple of those we can skate by just fine at Hyde Cottage with a couple of those, but after a couple of those kinds of days in succession, the heat creeps into every corner of this place, this rackety old house, and then there's no escape from it, and there's certainly no escape from it outside. Oh my, none whatsoever. There are shaded, deeply wooded areas that would be perfectly cool, even in this kind of weather, but there's no way to get to them, because this little dog overheats. She has her whole life, even when she was a tiny little puppy. That was one thing I noticed about her, is that she really tends to overheat. And she doesn't have any self-control. Her spirit is still incredibly high. So she can be overheating and walk herself straight to exhaustion. So I have to restrict her. And that's not popular. That's not going over well at all. But we're managing. I saw the weather forecast for the Boston area for the last few days. I pay very little attention, or try to actual weather forecasts, because all the data is available for you now yourself. You won't have the fine-tuned understanding of it that a professional meteorologist will have, but you'll be able to tell when a professional meteorologist is simply wrong, when for one reason or another, either an excess of caution, an excess of enthusiasm, or a hunt for clicks. They will simply misrepresent what your coming reality is. And there's no sense being subject to that anymore when you can download apps yourself to cobble together all the information that you need. And the weather forecasts for Boston have been saying boiling hot on Sunday, boiling hot on Monday, hot on Tuesday, but Tuesday marked by a wide bank of powerful thunderstorms and downpours that would signal a shift in the weather, so that maybe by the end of the week, the normal summer temperatures would return. And I looked at those forecasts, and then I looked at the data. And the data showed no reason why that would happen. None. Not only no chance of a massive bank of thunderstorms and rain, but also no chance of a significant drop in temperature. Not anywhere near that soon. And sure enough, the weather forecasts are now starting to change, because they can lie all they want, or misrepresent, or overshoot all they want about a forecast, but they can't actually usually lie about what's actually outside your front door, because then the jig is up. Every once in a while I've seen a weather system, a weather station that will do that anyway. They'll just say, yeah, it's sunny and beautiful in downtown Shreveport, and it's not sunny and beautiful in downtown Shreveport. They're either filming in the morning for an afternoon weather forecast, which doesn't make much sense, or they're just going with their models as opposed to what's outside in observable reality. But usually that's not the case. So now the weather forecasts are starting to change to not a single chance of even a random drop of rain in the greater Boston area today, and no chance of a significant drop in temperature for the rest of this week. I think that's what's going to happen, so I'm going to have to watch my baby very carefully, and we're going to have to restrict our outside activity, which she doesn't like at all. But anyway, welcome to your Daily Penguin, now that we've done our throat clearing. This is our tour through my Penguin Classic wall. We are going through the hits and misses, through the long stretches and periods and whatnot. And today's Penguin Classic is one of the most influential books in the Penguin Classic lineup, and was once upon a time as well known, easily, as the last two blockbusters that we've had. Dracula and the Count of Monte Cristo had a kind of explosive entry into the zeitgeist, into the collective reading consciousness that stayed true and was true everywhere in that whole landscape. And the book that we're doing today was, once upon a time, along those similar lines, but that isn't permanent. That doesn't have to stay. The really lucky books not only get there, but stay there, but they don't have to. There's no law that says that. And that is definitely true for our book today, which, oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. We haven't been far apart for days now. I got this in the mail. One of you made a present of it, and it is wonderful. It is 2,500 pages. It's incredibly floppy, and I'm in the middle of the Henry VI plays now. And I'm. This is not our Penguin Classic. It really should be. There really ought to be an oversized, big, one-volume Penguin Black Spine Classic collected Shakespeare. There really ought to be. It's incredible that there isn't such a thing, but there's this. So I have installed a bookmark that befits the solemnity and literary acumen of the occasion. Our greatest musical ever goes with our greatest writer ever. But this is not your Penguin Classic for today. Your Penguin Classic for today, which was once one of those absolutely universal zeitgeist bestsellers, is this, Common Sense by Thomas Paine, which came out in January of 1776 and literally changed the world. And those of you who have only heard of this author, or maybe only heard of it was a pamphlet, it's just a little thing. It takes no time at all to read. It's a tiny Penguin edition. Those of you who maybe have heard of these things but never read it, maybe don't know anything about its history, might think that's hyperbole, and it's not. This changed everything. For months and months, for years before January of 1776, a few dedicated activists, a few dedicated visionaries had been meeting with correspondence groups and town councils and prosperous farmers in town to sell their wares and in a tavern to drink away their woes, who had been going door to door talking to ordinary people, not about the prospect of getting this or that tax repealed, but of rebelling against the British Crown and establishing a new country. And to the ordinary people of the colonies, even in the Northeast, that was largely unthinkable. Even in 1775, that was largely unthinkable. To the ordinary person at that time, the idea of what you would do if the Crown was continuing to overreach and continuing to oppress was to... What are you doing? Huh? The automatic reaction on the part of ordinary people in those months and those years was to overreact in return. Dump some tea. Tar and feather some Crown officials. Tar and feather them in effigy. Hang them in effigy. Riot. Write for redress of grievances. Complain to your local officials. But not rebel against the British Crown, against the King, and establish a new country. Those things, it's hard to impress upon Americans that was not a fait accompli. That was not part of the bargain, even of systematic oppression, even in Boston, which was occupied by the forces of the Crown. Unlike most of the rest of the country, Boston actually bore the brunt of the King's tyranny by being occupied by British troops. The British troops who didn't just have tents and do drills on Boston Common, but who were quartered in the homes of people in Boston against their will. You'd be just a normal tallow maker, and you would have a house on Joy Street or whatever, and you'd have a family and some children, and you'd hear a pounding knock at your door, and it would be a sergeant, a redcoat sergeant, saying, "I've got 2 men, they're staying with you." You don't have a say in the matter. If you don't agree, they'll drag every one of you out of your house, and if they don't quarter their men in it, they'll burn it to the ground. That's a military occupation. Boston understood that. Boston was going through that. And yet, even most Bostonians thought only this has gone way too far. This is totally unjust. If the King could only be made aware of how bad this was, if only his ministers could be made aware of how bad this was, how unjust they were being, if their eyes could be opened, then they would change their tune and be more loving to their American cousins. Even in Boston, that was largely the way of it. And it was a few itinerant people walking around, riding around, going from place to place, from town to town, person by person, changing the minds of people and planting in those minds the idea that what's needed here is a new country. One of those people was Samuel Adams. One of those people was definitely not John Adams. So when people say, the great founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, John Adams, And when they sometimes, and just recently, in a new biography just recently, barely even mentioned Samuel Adams, when every single one of those people got the idea from Samuel Adams, and every single one of them had their resolve stiffened by Samuel Adams. It gets a little bit irritating, but even with the efforts of all those people, the idea that this could be a reality had not crystallized. It was still vague. It was still terrifying until this pamphlet came out. And this pamphlet changed everything. It was a way, one of those things that just strikes like a bolt of lightning and suddenly puts everything in perspective, lays out everything with a total, unsparing clarity, and leaves you, masterfully through its rhetoric, leaves you no alternative but to come to only one conclusion about what it lays out. An astonishing performance. One of the greatest rabble-rousing pamphleteering efforts ever done. Anywhere, not just in America. I always find it funny. I think the person who Richard Beeman, the historian who writes an introduction for this book, I think he does this. A lot of people, when they talk about Common Sense by Tom Paine, will say that it may very well be the most important pamphlet ever published in American history. Yeah, yeah, just maybe it might be. It was read everywhere, like wildfire. I know that's a hackneyed phrase, and it often is an overstatement of reality, but in this case, there isn't a phrase to accurately describe. Everyone read this. Everyone did. It was read out loud in taverns, and when the person who read it out loud at a tavern had finished, often the people in the tavern would pound the tables and demand the person get up on a chair and read it again. It was read from balconies of state houses all across the colonies, north and south, out loud to large gatherings who had been told ahead of time. They were told at 3 p.m, at 5, so-and-so is going to read Tom Paine's Common Sense out loud from the balcony. Show up. And they did in massive crowds to read this. And, of course, famously, George Washington had it read to his men. It has an electrifying effect even now when you read it. And for a long time, it was just like the Count of Monte Cristo and Dracula, it was in the bloodstream of readers. I don't think that's largely true anymore. I think it's largely fallen out, even in America. It's fallen out of that bloodstream. I myself maintain that it fell out of that bloodstream right about the same time that the Byzantine-style decadence entered into the bloodstream of America. Before 2020, I think most Americans were just so lazily complacent about the gem that those itinerant idea preachers brought about that they didn't care about a pamphlet outlining its essential necessity. They didn't care about anything like that because, of course, it's going to be around. Nobody likes it. It's kind of dumb, and of course, no one's recherché enough to be patriotic. But still, 2020 has changed that. At least with whatever section of the population it can be changed in. 2020 has made a lot of people in America wake up and say, this isn't perfect. There's a lot of evil, a lot of bad stuff here. And it's probably right that we get out and protest it. And B, this isn't permanent. One racist, sexist, fascist, lying moron who has a compliant attorney general and a compliant private police force could change this. In certain cities across the country, can change it overnight. So you work at Costco until 11, then you walk home 6 blocks. Like to get in a nice it feels great to get in that 6 blocks of a walk when you're done with your job at 11. Before you settle in for a quick bit of supper or maybe a show on Netflix, and then you go to bed. Only if you do that in Portland or Seattle or Chicago lately, well, what happens if you get brutalized, beaten in the head, shot in the face with what the press still euphemistically refers to as non-lethal rounds? Tear gassed, kidnapped, literally kidnapped, just snatched off your bike and thrown into a van by masked armed thugs of a fascist dictator. If you are an American and you watch the news, if you are outside of America and you watch the news and the news refers to federal agents doing these things, you are hearing a lie. You are hearing the mainstream media news once again fail in its job. If a man approaches you and he is wearing armor and a face mask and goggles and no identification, he is not a federal officer. He is an ordinary private individual, a thug, working for hire on behalf of someone else. You are being kidnapped. You are not being arrested or detained. There is no federal authority here. If someone approaches you and he is armed and armored and totally anonymous, he is not a federal operative. So if you hear that phrase, federal agents in the streets in Seattle or whatever, know that that part of it is a lie. The same kind of lies that the mainstream media has been telling about this administration for 4 years now. But seeing that on the nightly news, the one thing that this racist, sexist, fascist, lying moron who lives all day long on social media, the one thing that hasn't got through his bald, vat-tanned head is that if he can spend all day on social media, so can everyone else. They can see what he's doing. They can see what he's doing. And no matter how much you might try to spin it, ordinary Americans don't like the idea of armored thugs walking through their streets telling them, hurry it up, move along there, light them up. If I'm walking down your suburban street and I order you at the top of my lungs, screaming at you, get inside and don't look out the windows, and you don't instantly obey me, light them up. Just fire those rounds straight at these people on their porches in the suburb. You see enough of that on the news, you start to realize all of this is not permanent at all. It could go in a minute. It could go in a minute to you presenting identity papers every time you make that walk from Costco and every time you make that walk to Costco. Some bored ex-PE trainer in second-rate armor just saunters up to you and says, ID now. And instead of saying, go to hell, and, the horse you rode in on, because that's America, instead you have to say, eyes averted. Yes, sir, right away, sir. And if you don't do that, you get shot in the face with a quote-unquote non-lethal round. Boston was experiencing that when Tom Paine was writing this little pamphlet. America was experiencing that, but most America didn't know what the realities were like. The classic idea quoted by John Dickinson at a Continental Congress was, why is it always Boston that breaks the king's peace? Only if he had lived in Boston, he would have seen the reality of that. And eventually he did. Eventually everybody did. And this helped. Oh boy, did this help. Tom Paine wasn't from America. He wasn't born in America, but he caught the spirit of what was going on perfectly. And he wrote it perfectly. And that's why reading this is always kind of surreal, because we looked at Count Dracula and it entered the zeitgeist and stayed there. We looked at Count of Monte Cristo and it entered the zeitgeist and stayed there. And now we're looking at Common Sense, and it entered the zeitgeist and it stayed there for a while. Maybe it'll make a comeback, who knows. And this Penguin volume also includes, you can see there, a bit of The American Crisis Part 1. And the only reason that it does that is because, unlike Common Sense, which is cumulatively powerful and has wonderful phrases in it, unlike Common Sense, The American Crisis actually starts powerfully, rhetorically, on just a rhetorical level, so that editors can never bring themselves to leave it out, especially since the Americans who know anything about Common Sense think that this is how it starts. They don't think about American Crisis. They think this is in Common Sense, and it's not. Everybody wishes that it were, but it's not. The American Crisis Part 1 starts like this. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will in this crisis shrink from the service of his country, but he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered, yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph, and so on. The opening section, salvo 2 or 3 paragraphs of The American Crisis, is virtuoso stuff, just amazing. But it's not part of Common Sense. Common Sense is amazing in its own way, definitely. Read it out loud, definitely. But you have to include that. And I myself, of course, would not object if this volume were 3 times as long. Why not? Why not include all of The American Crisis, and why not include a lot of other Tom Paine? A big, fat, 1,000-page book, Penguin volume of Thomas Paine would be great. Most people aren't familiar enough with this guy's writing. Even when this book was a signature in the zeitgeist of the American public, most people still didn't know most of this author's work, all of which is incredible. What a amazing. The more you know about Thomas Paine's life, the more you find you're a little skeptical that he would ever be able to be any good at anything. But it turns out when he was writing hot, No revisions, no sitting and pondering. Boy, oh boy, could he master a kind of rhetoric that just pulls you along. So I wouldn't mind if this were 10 times as long, but I'll take this. and it kind of continues the thread that's been going through these Penguin Classics, which is, in their own way, massive books. It's just that this one, I don't know how you would describe this. It's not at everyone's fingertips anymore. And when they think it is, they're quoting the beginning of American Crisis, not anything in Common Sense. But nevertheless, your Penguin Classic is a recommend. You can read Common Sense. I know I always say you can read these books in an hour, and some of you sass me back saying Steve can read it in an hour, but I can't. But this thing you can read in no time at all. Common Sense you can read in no time at all. If you're American, you really should, because it's a founding document. No matter how odd that is to say, it's a founding document. I myself think that it is more quintessentially a founding document than anything else that might exist in the Smithsonian Institute, because it's a rabble-rousing pamphlet. And that very much is in character with America in the way that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution are not. Either way, if you're an American, read Common Sense. Maybe read up on it. But anyway, that's your Penguin for today. It is a recommend, of course, and we'll see what tomorrow brings. Will it be an obscure book, or will it be another book that once upon a time started and fretted its hour on the stage? Well, that'd be great. We'll see one way or another. I'm going to wrap this up for now, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.